Welcome to your fifth and final key concepts lecture for this course. Over the last 4 weeks and last four modules, we've gone over the basics of the correction system in the United States. We've learned about the process from arrest to incarceration, reintegration, and probation. We've learned about the goals of corrections and the different philosophies behind the system. We've seen the system evolve from public beatings to rehabilitation. We've explored the different types of programs that are generally available, from education and vocational programs to substance abuse and treatment for the mentally ill. As, we, as we've explored these various topics, we've discussed the strengths and shortcomings associated with each. We've seen how limited resources and a focus on punishment can lead to inhumane living conditions. Though we've discussed these shortcomings in broad stroke, today we are going to further explore the shortcomings and where there are the biggest needs for improvement. We will look at whether longer punishments are related to recidivism rates. We will explore the economic costs of incarceration. We will take a look at racial disparities, and we will discuss some alternatives for moving forward. This key concepts lecture is very focused on numbers. So if you're particularly interested in economics, you may find this lecture to be the most interesting yet. First, let's look at the statistics linking length of incarceration and likelihood of recidivism. It is undisputed that the United States has more individuals incarcerated than any other nation. We incarcerate almost 2 million people spread between state prison, federal prison, local jails, juvenile detention centers, immigration detention centers, Indian country jails, military prisons, civil commitment centers, and state psychiatric hospitals. This number has more than tripled since the 1960s due to the war on drugs, an increase on punishment as opposed to rehabilitation. State prisons hold the largest number of those incarcerated individuals, followed by local jails and then federal prisons. When I first started going through these numbers, I was surprised at how much fewer federal prisoners there are compared to inmates in state facilities. Federal prisons house approximately 203,000 inmates, while inmates house more than half of the incarcerated population, just over 1 million inmates. The local jails house the second largest inmate population, about a quarter of the total inmate population, or nearly 500,000 inmates. Most of those housed at local jails are not serving individual sentences, but in fact are those just awaiting trial. We know from a previous module that women are most often incarcerated for drug or property crimes. But what are we looking at when we combine all incarcerated people? Well, let's start with state prisons. More than half of those housed at a state prison are convicted of a violent offense: drug crimes, property crimes, and public order crimes. Public order crimes are crimes such as DUIs and illegal possession of weapons. These crimes are all about the same, between 120,000 and 143,000 inmates. In local jails, of those convicted, public order crimes are the most frequently seen crime among the convicted offenders. Drug, violent crimes, and property crimes are all about the same, ranging from 22 to 26,000. At federal prisons, drug and public order crimes are very close to being the most convicted offense, around 68 and 63,000 inmates. Violent offenses are counted at just 11,000. You can see how that's broken down here in this graph on the slide. We have the state prisons in the teal color, the local jails in the orange color, and in the yellow color we have federal prisons and federal jails. And then on the outer edge of the circle, we have the different crimes that are named and how many inmates have been convicted or being housed for those crimes in that particular facility. And we have, despite this huge number of incarcerated individuals, we also have one of the highest rates of recidivism in the world. 76.6% of prisoners are rearrested within 5 years of being released from a correctional facility. To get even more in the weeds with this number, within 3 years of release, 2 out of 3 former prisoners are rearrested, and more than 50% of those are incarcerated again. We also know from previous modules that the correctional system is housing more and more individuals needing mental health treatment. In fact, 37% of prison inmates and 44% of those in jail have been diagnosed with a mental health illness, yet 66% of inmates reported not receiving any form of mental health care during the full length of their incarceration. The statistics seem to show that when operated properly, the rehabilitation programs do reduce recidivism. Inmates who participate in education programs have a 43% lower chance of being reincarcerated, while inmates who are taught valuable skills and have a job during the time of their incarceration have a 24% lower chance of being reincarcerated. Norway, by contrast, has one of the lowest recidivism rates in the world at 20%. There is a 40% increase in employment rates for former inmates. Scholars attribute this change to the heavy focus on rehabilitation and reintegration programs for inmates through the empathetic and human approach that Norway has adopted, and that we looked at in depth in the previous module. And you may be surprised to learn that a lengthier prison sentence does not deter future crime. Scholars theorize this is due to several reasons. First, there's a desensitization that happens when serving a long sentence, so that the threat of incarceration is not as scary as it was before the long sentence was served. They've already done it and can do it again if needed. Second, sometimes being housed with other criminal offenders can breed new criminal behavior. Third, the research shows that while the certainty of punishment may deter crime, the length of the sentence does not. I'll say that one again. While the certainty of punishment may deter crime, the length of the sentence does not. And fourth, the research shows that offenders tend to age out of criminal activity by the age of 35, meaning they are less likely to commit crime due to their older age and not because they served a long prison sentence. These statistics are meaningful given the number of inmates serving long prison sentences. For our course purposes, we are defining long prison sentences as at least 10 years, and over half the prison population is sentenced to at least 10 years. This is a jump from 44% in 2000. There are 12 jurisdictions where 2/3 or more of the prison population is serving a long prison sentence. These include Georgia, West Virginia, Alabama, Montana, Hawaii, Oklahoma, Louisiana, Utah, Maryland, Michigan, Mississippi, and Washington, D.C. Why do we care that we have a huge prison population that continues to commit crimes once released? Well, if our goal is to ensure public safety, we want to make sure offenders are not committing new crimes once they are released back into society. But even if our goal is pure punishment, we still care based on the staggering amount of money that is required to house inmates. Housing inmates in prison and jails is a staggering sum on both the societal level and the amount purely spent by governments on the facilities themselves. Let's break down where these numbers come from. Federal and state governments report spending $80 billion annually to operate prisons and jails. The FSU publication that we read indicates that this is the cost purely spent on housing inmates in 1 year. But this $80 billion is not the entire cost. The publication also estimates that the pure operation of the prisons actually costs an extra $11.1 billion by the time we include the pension obligations, healthcare benefits for staff, and the bare bones healthcare provided for inmates. So that brings us to $91.1 billion that's purely spent on the facilities and the staff as paid for by the government. As we know from a previous module, prisons often outsource a number of the costs to the families of the incarcerated, such as to pay for the inmate's communication, be it on a tablet, phone, or email. Families often also pay for extra food and living supplies. We know corrections does not provide enough soap for a week, and families usually shoulder the extra expenses. But there are additional costs that economists often look at when calculating the cost of an action. In this particular category, economists also want to know what sort of financial ramifications from incarceration are incurred by the children with an incarcerated family. The studies show the child is more likely to commit crime as well and have reduced earning potential. Not to mention, families may have to move closer to the correctional facility, and there's an increased rate of divorce. Economists also like to estimate the opportunity cost in other categories. For example, what sort of wages would the person who is incarcerated would the inmate have earned but for being incarcerated? The study estimates this to be a staggering $392 billion. Altogether, the publication estimates that correctional spending is over $1,000 billion. That's 6% of the GDP and 11 times larger than what current estimates are for correction spending. We see that families are shouldering an overwhelming burden of a lot of these expenses. And despite all this money, prisons are still overcrowded and still barely providing the minimum requirements as mandated by the Eighth Amendment. In fact, California was completely missing the mark for years until federal courts ordered California to reduce its prison populations by 44,000 inmates as the conditions literally amounted to cruel and unusual punishment. More specifically, California was operating its prisons at 190% of its capacity. That's almost double its capacity. And the federal court ordered California to reduce that to 137.5% in order to meet an inmate's basic needs and be constitutionally in line. Though California provided incentives to send fewer offenders to prison and reduce the prison populations, the prisons were still operating at 179.5% of capacity. There were public safety concerns, though, at suddenly releasing thousands of offenders. So California began to shift the burden of housing inmates to the local governments and mandated that parolees who violated the terms of their release without committing a new felony, so maybe they missed a curfew, those individuals with the violation would serve time at a local facility instead of going back to the state prison. Additionally, nonviolent offenders with no record of sexual, violent, or serious crimes were also ordered to serve their time at local facilities instead of the state facilities. California had to act several other regulations, though, to reduce their state prison populations because the shift to local was not enough. So, contracted beds in other non-state facilities. California opened a specific healthcare facility for those who were convicted of a crime, and it stopped sentencing offenders to life sentences for violating the three strikes rule unless the offender committed a serious or violent crime on the third offense. California also reduced the penalties for drug and property offenses. By 2015, California finally met the prison population mandate and has been able to maintain that status quo ever since. By reducing the number of people incarcerated, there was also a fear that crime would rise. But it didn't for the most part. The only crime that did increase was a property offense, which was attributed to an increase in theft of vehicles. And perhaps unsurprisingly, recidivism rates were also unchanged. Since the focus was purely on getting people out of state prison, but not helping them reintegrate or lead more lawful lives, it makes sense that the recidivism rates would also be the same. On the other hand, correction spending has continued to increase at the state level despite the reduced number of inmates. It seems the majority of the increase in spending is due to better outfitting the facilities that do exist and to the medical and mental health care. One article reports that California spends twice as much on housing an inmate as it would cost to send the inmate to the highest priced university in California for an undergraduate degree. And it's not just California that's struggling with the rising cost to house inmates. The feds, too, are struggling with the increased costs. Just like at home, it is getting more and more expensive to just provide food for the inmates. And correction spending has had to increase across the board with regards to paying for staff and medical personnel. And our course would not be complete if we did not discuss the racial disparities seen in modern day correctional facilities. We can't understand the high rates of mass incarceration and recidivism if we don't look at the underlying crimes and the people being sentenced. Generally, we see racial disparities across the board, from arrest to sentence length. Black Americans are incarcerated in state prisons at nearly 5 times the rate of white. Nationally, 1 in 81 Black adults in the U.S. is serving time in state prison. Wisconsin leads the nation in Black imprisonment rates. One of every 36 Black Wisconsinites is in prison. Studies indicate that the disparity is particularly troublesome when it comes to drug offenses. All factors being equal, a Black person who commits a drug offense is more likely to be incarcerated than a white person. On the local jail level, the racial disparity is quite evident. On the local level, we see the following disparities. The rate of incarcerating Black individuals increased by 8%, while it only increased by 0.4% for white individuals. In 2022, Black people were 4 times more likely than the white people to be sentenced to jail. And I actually already passed by that slide, so I will go back to it. You see that graph depicted here. The racial disparities are largest within the young adult population. The rate of sentencing young Black people to jail is nearly double in all 3 counties that this study examined than older Black people. The 3 cities that were examined were in Durham, North Carolina, Louisville, Kentucky, and St. Louis, Missouri. Compared to the white young adult populations, the white young adult populations, it is almost 6 times as many people. And while Black men are generally being sentenced longer than white or Hispanic men, Black women are being sentenced to nearly similar lengths as their white and Hispanic counterparts. By all accounts, major reforms are needed in the correction system. The facilities are overcrowded and basic needs are not being met. Society is paying huge sums for our country's mass incarceration rates, and there is a huge racial disparity. What kind of reforms are needed? As the textbook has stated in almost every section, better attention needs to be placed in utilizing evidence-based practices. Perhaps we want to stop sending so many people to incarcerated facilities in the first place. Perhaps we want to invest more resources in rehabilitation and reintegration programs to try to reduce recidivism rates. Perhaps we want to better support the communities most impacted by incarceration, and perhaps we want to work harder to eradicate implicit bias from the system. It seems there are many social components involved in tackling the issues that arise from mass incarceration. You were assigned a music video from the Lady Lifers in your prep work for this module. While there are no statistics in the music video, I thought it would still be helpful to view. The lyrics of the song give a glimpse at how the system worked for the Lady Lifers. They were all sentenced to a life term, literally a life term, and it seems from the song lyrics that literally life means life. So they all have served a considerable amount of time already, as we saw in the video. At some point, we have to ask, what's the point? If someone has served 40 plus years in prison, what is the benefit to more time? Is it more punishment? We know that after 35 years old, it's unlikely that these women will commit another crime. And I think certainly after over 40 years, our goal is no longer rehabilitation. And if there's no possibility of parole, then there's no reintegration goal either. So it would seem that's just purely punishment. There are a number of budding alternatives to try that might help with the mass incarceration issues. These ideas bring us to this module's assignment. Before you start shouting woohoo, because there's only one assignment in this module as opposed to the normal two, you should know that there is only one assignment because there is an extra reading required to do the assignment. You're being asked to read an academic article written by one of the leading legal scholars in the criminal law field, Professor Paul Butler. Professor Paul Butler suggests looking to the lyrics of hip hop music when analyzing corrections. He pulls lyrics from some of the infamous songs and examines how hip hop views the current correction system. At the end of the article, he also explores how the hip hop culture might begin to revamp the system. I'm not going to spend any more time really talking about the article because you are assigned to read it, and I'm really looking forward to seeing how you engage and what your thoughts are on this approach as you complete the assignment. You do still have a quiz that will follow the same format as the other 4 modules. There's 20 multiple choice questions and a short answer essay. As far as the study guide, you should know what types of crimes account for the majority of inmates, what recidivism means, and what the statistics in America show. The quiz won't heavily ask you about all the statistics as far as numbers go, so you won't need to know, the specific rate necessarily that, young Black men are being incarcerated as opposed to young white men. But you should know the prevailing ideas of what the numbers show, such as that young Black men are being incarcerated at far higher numbers than young white men are being incarcerated. You should also know why long prison sentences don't deter crime and why all this matters from this financial standpoint. What is happening to the communities that are most impacted by the mass incarceration? We used California as a case example and saw that crime did not rise the way we were concerned about when California reformed its sentencing. And you should be familiar, as I said, with the racial disparities that are rampant in the U.S. correction system and why that matters for reform purposes. We need to know what the underlying crimes are and why they're being committed in order for the crimes to not be committed in the first place. And finally, you should be familiar with the ways to reform our current system's shortcomings that might make a real impact. It's been an absolute pleasure creating these key concept lectures for you this semester. Best of luck.